In 1969, Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir made headlines with this comment: "There is no such thing as the Palestinian people. It's not as if we came and threw them out and took their country. They didn't exist." Golda's statement was controversial, but as it turned out, many Arab leaders and historians agreed with her. In 1937, Arab leader Ani Abdul Hadi made this statement to the British Peel Commission: "There is no such country as Palestine. Palestine is a term the Zionists invented. There is no Palestine in the Bible. Palestine is alien to us." Nearly a decade later, Arab historian Philip Hitti agreed. In his testimony to the Anglo-American Committee, "There is no such thing as Palestine in history. Absolutely not." In 1956, a Saudi representative to the UN stated, "It is common knowledge that Palestine is nothing but southern Syria." And more recently, Syrian dictator Hafez al-Assad gave this lecture to PLO leader Yasser Arafat: "Never forget this one point. There is no such thing as a Palestinian people. There is no Palestinian entity. Palestine is an integral part of Syria."
With the Peel Commission of 1936, the British government offered for the first time the partition of the land, the partition of Palestine into a Jewish Palestine and into an Arab Palestine. We were all Palestinians because this was the nature of this administrative unit, Palestina. Now the Palestinians are owning this nationality as being the nation of Palestine, but this is not quite historically true.
So what is the historical truth? Who are the Palestinians and what are their claims to the land of Israel? Let's take a look. Many Palestinian Arabs, including Arafat, have claimed to be descendants of the ancient Canaanites. A convenient argument, since the Canaanites were the first known inhabitants of the land of Israel. Even as recently as May of 2014, a PA spokesman stated that the Palestinians have been in the land for 5,000 years. But history shows that there's no way the Palestinians could be related to the Canaanites, because the Canaanites were almost completely obliterated by the Israelites in the 13th century BC. The few that remained were assimilated into Israelite culture. Palestinians also claim that the ancient Philistines are their ancestors, and it's true that they take their name from the tribe of Goliath. But do they actually share DNA? The Philistines were a seafaring people who came from Crete, the largest of the Greek islands.
The Philistines got their name from the Hebrew word Plishtim, which actually means invaders. Palestine means invaded land. Why should we call it that?
When the Philistines invaded Israel in the 12th century BC, they stayed close to the Mediterranean coast. They never settled in Jerusalem, Hebron, or Jericho, all cities claimed today by the Palestinians. By the 7th century BC, the Philistines had been assimilated by the Assyrians, then conquered by the Babylonians. From there, they disappeared from the pages of history. And experts say no one alive today could prove Philistine lineage. But if the Palestinians want to claim them, they would have to acknowledge that their real ancestral homeland is not Israel, but the Greek island of Crete. The Palestinians may not have gotten their DNA from the Philistines, but they did get their name. When the Roman Emperor Hadrian conquered Jerusalem in AD 135, he was determined to eradicate even the memory of the Jews and erase their connection to the land of Israel. So Hadrian renamed the region after their historical enemies, calling it Syria Palestina, the Latin translation for Philistine. So if they're not Canaanites and they're not Philistines, who are the Palestinians? Biologically, they share DNA with Saudis, Iraqis, Syrians, and Jordanians. Simply put, they're Arabs.
Never in history was there a Palestinian nation or a Palestinian state. At that time, nobody was thinking in lines of a Palestinian people. They were all Arabs.
Behind me is one of the most controversial pieces of real estate in the world. The Temple Mount is the holiest site in Judaism and the third holiest in Islam. Muslim tradition says that Muhammad traveled here to the Al-Aqsa Mosque on his famous night journey, and that tradition forms the basis for the Palestinians' claim to Jerusalem. Arabs claim Jerusalem as the Islamic city of Al-Quds. But there's no record that the Prophet Muhammad had ever been there, and even his armies didn't arrive there until 5 years after his death. The city of Jerusalem isn't mentioned even once in the Quran, while the Hebrew Bible mentions it more than 600 times. In Muhammad's lifetime, it was a fairly unimportant city in the Byzantine Empire. It was a Christian city without a single mosque. When the Muslims conquered Jerusalem, they chose to build their mosques on the Jewish Temple Mount, believing it to be a holy site. There they built the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa, whose name was copied from the story of the night journey in the Quran. Several Muslim scholars place the construction of the mosque around 690, while Muhammad died in 632. So how could Muhammad's famous night journey have taken him to a mosque in Jerusalem that wouldn't be built until after his death? The Quran doesn't mention Jerusalem, but says that Muhammad's dream flight took him to Al-Aqsa, which means the farthest place. Early Islamic scholars interpreted that to mean a heavenly place, or the courtyard of Allah. That all changed as Islam evolved into a political force. During the Crusades, the Muslim general Saladin changed Islamic tradition to strengthen the Muslim claim to Jerusalem. He stated that Muhammad's flight took him not to heaven, but to the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. And today, the Jewish Temple Mount is also the third holiest site in Islam, second only to the Arabian cities of Mecca and Medina. Muslims believe that once they claim a piece of land, it belongs to Islam forever. Still, at the beginning of the 20th century, Islamic leaders acknowledged the Temple Mount's Jewish history. In 1924, Jerusalem's Supreme Islamic Council published this tourist pamphlet on the Temple Mount. It says the site's identity with the site of Solomon's Temple is beyond dispute. This, too, is the spot, according to the universal belief, on which David built there an altar unto the Lord. The pamphlet also describes the underground chamber the Crusaders called Solomon's Stables. It dates probably as far back as the construction of Solomon's Temple. In 1927, a strong earthquake damaged the mosque, and during renovations, archaeologists analyzed the structure. They found beams made from cedar of Lebanon and Cyprus, dating as far back as the 9th century BC, around the time of King Solomon, who had used those very materials to build the first Jewish temple. The excavations also uncovered a Jewish ritual bath from the Second Temple and a mosaic believed to be part of a Byzantine church. Most historians agree the Jews were here first, but the Arabs will argue that they were here the longest, and the so-called right of return has been a constant theme at every Middle East peace summit since 1948. From the Crusades until the 19th century, the Arab population had only grown from around 200,000 to 300,000. Arab growth was stagnant, and population experts say it would have stayed that way, except for one thing: the arrival of the Jews. With the waves of Jewish immigration starting in 1882, Arabs started flooding into Palestine from neighboring countries. And they came for two reasons. One, to enjoy a higher standard of living in Palestine, and two, to fight the immigration of the Jews who made that standard of living possible. By 1948, the Arab population of Palestine was 1.3 million. The British governor of the Sinai once remarked, "It is very difficult to make a case for the misery of the Arabs if at the same time their compatriots from adjoining states could not be kept from going in to share that misery." Some experts say, if the Palestinian Arabs want a legal return to their countries of origin, they would have to return to places like Egypt, Iraq, Morocco, and Syria, but not to Israel. Today, many world leaders call on Israel to return to its 1967 borders. But if you look at history, those borders aren't from 1967. In fact, they're not even real borders.
The borders of the West Bank are armistice lines which were created by results of the war of 1948. And at the end of the war, this is where the armies stood still. This is how the quote-unquote border of 1967 or of 1949 was created. So the 1967, which is an armistice line, served as a border between Israel and the state of Jordan. And the state of Jordan also annexed the West Bank, and it became part of Jordan.
When Jordan occupied the West Bank and East Jerusalem in 1949, the Jews were ethnically cleansed from both places. At least 30 synagogues were destroyed, and Jews were banned from holy sites like the Western Wall, while Palestinian Arabs living there automatically became Jordanian citizens. So Israel can't go back to the so-called 67 borders for three reasons. One, before 1967, the West Bank was controlled by Jordan, not by the Palestinians, and Jordan's annexation of it violated international law. Two, the land was legally promised to the Jews by the British Mandate of 1922. And three, there was no Palestinian state in 1967, or ever. As Golda Meir once said, "How can we return the occupied territories? There is no one to return them to."
The term occupation is when you possess something which is not yours or which is someone else's. This is not the case of the West Bank. When you talk about occupation, yes, there were many occupations over the West Bank, starting with the Babylonians and Assyrians and Greeks and Romans, all the way to the Ottomans and to the Brits. To call the Jews occupiers in their own home, this is really a unique travesty of history. The West Bank was never held by the Palestinians. They were never sovereigns. In fact, there was no other sovereign over the West Bank than the Jewish people.
It's the oldest land dispute in history. For centuries, Jews and Arabs have both claimed to be the rightful owners of the land of Israel. Jewish claims to the land are based on four main arguments. The first is God's promise to Abraham. Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion often said that the Bible was the Jewish mandate for settling the land of Israel. In the book of Genesis, God gave the land to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs of Israel. And the rest of the Bible tells the story of their descendants in the land. Moses led the Jews back to Israel after their exile in Egypt. And roughly 400 years later, around 1000 BC, King David conquered the city of Jerusalem and built his capital there. But the story of the Jews isn't limited to the borders of modern Israel. Their footprints have been traced throughout Judea and Samaria, now the Palestinian West Bank. Bethel, where Jacob dreamed of a ladder to heaven. Shiloh, the resting place of the Ark of the Covenant. Bethlehem, the birthplace of King David. And Hebron, where the Jewish patriarchs are buried.
This is all not just documented in the Bible and in history, it also reveals itself in every inch of the land. In any archaeological dig, you just scratch the surface and you find a rich Jewish culture and history of more than 3,500 years, ever since King David built Jerusalem 3,010 years ago.
The Jewish rule over Israel was also documented outside the Bible, often by the enemies of Israel. In Egypt, an inscription on the Merneptah Stela proclaimed in the 13th century BC that Israel has been laid waste. In 840 BC, the Moabite king Mesha wrote about the house of David, as did another king a century later, Hazael of Damascus. In the 1st century AD, the Jewish historian Josephus described in great detail the Jewish temple in Jerusalem and its destruction by the Romans, a story confirmed by a relief in the Arch of Titus in Rome. Every day, archaeology yields more evidence of ancient Jewish culture dating back thousands of years. And in the 20th century, that historical connection has been recognized several times by international law. In 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issued a declaration calling for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, also known then as southern Syria.
Palestine included at the time all the territory which is now Israel, which is also Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and Jordan.
In 1920, Allied leaders gathered in San Remo, Italy to divide the remains of the Ottoman Empire. They created the San Remo Resolution, which incorporated the Balfour Declaration. The resolution was signed by the members of the League of Nations, and the British were put in charge of Palestine. That meant they were legally bound to help the Jewish people build a state there. 2 years later, in 1922, the League adopted the British Mandate for Palestine, which recognized the historical connection of the Jewish people and the need for reconstituting their national home there. By that time, the land allocated to the Jewish people had been drastically reduced, with more than 75% of it going to the new Arab kingdom of Transjordan. The mandate was signed by all 51 members of the League of Nations, and once again, a Jewish state was guaranteed by international law. But 25 years later, that state still existed only on paper. And in 1945, the League was replaced by the United Nations. Article 80 of the UN Charter states, that the UN would not alter existing states, peoples, or mandates, which means the UN legally recognized the right of the Jewish people to settle in Palestine, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea.
The United Nations is the legal successor and inheritor of the League of Nations, which means all obligations, commitments, and pledges of the League of Nations must be upheld by the United Nations. Unfortunately, they did not do it in the case of Israel and the Jewish ownership over their land.
In November 1947, the land intended for the Jews was divided once again. The UN voted to partition what was left of Palestine into two parts. 56% would be a Jewish state, with 43% going to an Arab state to be annexed to Jordan. Once again, a Jewish state was mandated by international law. Israel declared its independence in 1948. And a year later, the new state was admitted to the United Nations. But despite numerous legal endorsements, Israel's borders would still be disputed for decades to come, as Arab leaders incited violence against Israel.
The Mufti, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, say, what they, the United Nations, write with ink, we destroy it by blood.
In 2002, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan famously used the phrase illegal occupation to describe Israel's annexation of the West Bank in 1967. But Annan's critics were quick to point out his use of the word illegal was incorrect because the West Bank never legally belonged to Palestinian Arabs in the first place. Palestine was ruled by the Ottoman Turks from 1516 to 1918. Then for the next 30 years, it was controlled by the British until Israel declared its independence. During the war that followed, the Kingdom of Jordan invaded the West Bank and formally annexed the land in 1950.
There is a lack of historical understanding, and also there is an abuse here by this saying of international law. Since the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, was annexed by Jordan, it was a Jordanian territory, and in 1967, the 6 Days War, when Israel had, again, a campaign of self-defense, when three armies of Syria, Jordan, and Egypt were surrounding us, ready to drive us into the sea, Israel won the war, and as a result, we took into possession the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. This land was captured from Jordan.
Since Israel recaptured the land from Jordan, it now belongs to Israel, according to international law. One judge on the International Court of Justice wrote the following about the 1967 war. A state acting in lawful exercise of its right of self-defense may seize and occupy foreign territory, as long as such seizure and occupation are necessary to its self-defense. And where the prior holder of territory had seized that territory unlawfully, the state which subsequently takes that territory in the lawful exercise of self-defense has against that prior holder better title.
We bought our land in the blood of our soldiers. We didn't start with a war. The Arabs started with a war. All over the world, the idea when someone started with a war and he failed, he paid the price. He paid the price. So why we have to pay the price now?
The last claim the Jewish people make for the land of Israel focuses not on how they got it, but what they did with it. Today, Israel's population is well over 8 million. But in 1850, only 350,000 people lived in Israel and the West Bank. In 1857, the British consul in Palestine reported that the area was empty of inhabitants and that its greatest need is a body of population. A decade later, British scientist H.B. Tristram wrote that whole villages there are rapidly disappearing from the face of the earth. And American writer Mark Twain wrote this about the Jezreel Valley: "There is not a solitary village for 30 miles in either direction. There are 2 or 3 small clusters of Bedouin tents, but not a single permanent habitation." Today, many Palestinian Arabs claim that the Jews stole Arab land, evicted the owners, and left thousands of Arab farmers homeless. But is that the real story? Let's take a look. As early as the 1850s, Jewish people started buying land in Palestine, but their choices were limited by Arab sellers.
The Arabs settled mainly in mountainous areas, and they did not offer those lands for sale. The Arabs wanted to sell land in places where they did not live, in places which they had left in the past.
Records show that most of the land purchased by the Jews belonged to a small group of wealthy Muslim families, most of whom didn't even live in Palestine.
The Arabs were from many walks of life. Effendis who lived in Beirut and in Damascus, as well as locals. Also people who lived in the rural villages. All of them were willing to sell their land. There was always more land available than the demand for them.
From the beginning, the Jewish policy was clear. No Arabs were to be removed from their land against their will. In 1920, Zionist labor leader David Ben-Gurion announced that under no circumstances must we touch land belonging to fellahin or work by them. Only if a fellah leaves his place of settlement should we offer to buy his land at an appropriate price.
The Jewish National Fund bought the lands legally in order to fully secure the ownership of these lands. The Arabs were not evicted from the lands. They received compensation and the full process for the lands.
That compensation was documented by the British Peel Commission in 1937. The group had been sent to Palestine to investigate clashes between Arabs and Jews. Their report shows that of the 664 Arab workers dispossessed by land sales, 347 were resettled by the British government for free. The rest refused help and found employment elsewhere. Not only did the Jews buy the land legally, they also paid 10 times the normal rate. In 1944, the going rate for rich, fertile soil in Iowa was $110 an acre, while in Palestine, Jews were paying more than $1,000 an acre for arid, rocky land.
They say they are crazy. They buy this land. It's dirty land. It's no good land. But they are not stupid, and they know that we must work very hard, and they work very hard. Look what we have. We are only 66 years old, and look what we have already.
In the 19th century, life was hard under Ottoman rule for Arab workers in Palestine. Many had lost their farms to heavy Turkish taxes or Bedouin raiders. There were no schools, no electricity, and little sanitation. The average life expectancy for an Arab male in Palestine was 30. With the arrival of the Jewish settlers, all of that started to change. With hard work, they turned swamps into vineyards, farms, and citrus groves. They introduced electricity to Palestine and improved the sanitation. They also worked to eradicate the mosquitoes that caused malaria. And the local Arabs benefited from their work. Over a 20-year period, the infant mortality rate for Arab children was cut in half, and the life expectancy for Arab men increased by 12 years. The Jewish landowners hired many of them to help work the land and paid them better than their Arab employers.
First of all, following the purchase of land, the Arab population had income. With the help of this money, they could improve their living, and the Arab society could raise their standard of living. So because of Jewish purchase of lands, the economic and social conditions of the Arab society were better.
Arabs from neighboring countries flocked to Palestine to take advantage of the higher standard of living. From 1922 to 1947, the total Arab population in Palestine more than doubled. In the city of Haifa, the number of Arabs increased by 290%. In Jerusalem, 131%, and in Jaffa, 158%. In 1939, Jewish scholar Martin Buber described the cooperation between Arabs and Jews in a letter to Mahatma Gandhi. The Jewish farmers have begun to teach their brothers, the Arab farmers, to cultivate the land more intensively. Together with them, we want to cultivate the land, to serve it, as the Hebrew has it. The more fertile this soil becomes, the more space there will be for us and for them. We have no desire to dispossess them. We want to live with them. By the time Israel declared independence in 1948, the Jewish people had already built a strong network of communal farms that stretched from the Galilee to the Negev. They'd also built schools, hospitals, roads, and cities. In other words, they were already functioning as an independent state.
When Ben-Gurion declared the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948, he already had a base, a territorial foundation of lands and settlements, a large number of settlements spread throughout Israel, settlements built on lands purchased by the Jewish people.
Despite the valid historical and legal claims of the Jewish people to their land, Israel's borders are still being negotiated after nearly 7 decades of statehood.
Even though there is no doubt, not historic, not moral, not archaeological doubt about the connection of Israel to the land and the land to Israel, Israelis are willing to compromise just in order to save lives, just in order to achieve peace. We will wait until we have a partner on the Palestinian side which is trustworthy, which does not believe in the destruction of Israel and the Jewish people as a way to build their own national narrative, and willing to live with us in peace and cooperation.